Good morning. Jon Meacham is a journalist and presidential historian. He began his career as the editor of Newsweek at age 26, and to this day regularly contributes to Time magazine and the New York Times. Mr. Meacham has written numerous novels on the New York Times bestseller list, including Franklin and Winston, an intimate portrait of an epic friendship, American Lion, with Andrew Jackson in the White House, which won the Pulitzer Prize for biography in 2009. Mr. Meacham, in writing his most recent biography, Destiny and Power, The American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush, proved to be a diligent and trustworthy source of history, interviewing and researching the Bush family for over 26 years. Destiny and Power went on to become one of Mr. Meacham's New York Times bestsellers. Additionally, being a fresh and relevant source of history, Mr. Meacham appears on political panels such as Charlie Rose, Meet the Press, and Morning Joe, and wade through the political world in a rare manner. He discusses topics from a moderate perspective, supported by historical facts and analysis. Mr. Meacham currently lives in Nashville and is an NBA father, as Mr. Joy mentioned, and a very active member of our community. Finally, Mr. Meacham is a lover of his family, his friends, the written word, and most importantly, as Mr. Meacham would add, the Padron cigar number 35 and 65. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Jon Meacham.
Thank you, Philip. That's a very generous introduction, overly generous, but I got some cigars out of it, so I'm already ahead on the day. Don't know about you all. Philip and I have a mutual friend who is starting a Nashville mobile cigar, sort of a food truck for cigars, in which I am, in fact, the only investor. So either I'm Facebook employee number 2, or I'll be doing a lot of these speeches going forward. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for having me. Whenever I think that a kind introduction is actually really on point, my mind goes back to, I guess it's been 9 years ago now. I was at the National Book Festival on the Washington Mall, and it's a wonderful event. And I was on my way to give my talk at that point about Andrew Jackson, and a woman ran up to me, which doesn't happen enough as a basic rule, and said, "Oh my God, it's you." And I said, "Well, yes, existentially speaking, that's hard to argue with." And this may be one of the few rooms in Nashville, Tennessee, where I can use existential as an adverb. That's good. She said, "Will you wait right here? I want you to sign your new book." And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And I was standing there, and I was thinking, she went off to buy it. And I went off, I think I really have the world right where I want it. I have women running up to me, I'm being recognized. This is really great. And she brought back John Grisham's latest novel. So whenever I think I have the world right where I want it, I remember, or someone like Philip is right on point, I remember that somewhere in America there's a woman with a forged copy of The Runaway Jury. That is a true story. That's a true story. So thank you all. Thank you for what you do. As the father of a 14-year-old whom I left with his, what my wife and I call his third hand of the phone, looking at it this morning. I'm a product of an Episcopal Montessori, which is redundant when you think about it, in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and of Macaulay School, a boys' school there, and am a great believer. I went to Sewanee, the University of the South. Mr. Joy and I share that. Sewanee, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is best understood as a combination of Downton Abbey and Deliverance. It's sort of an odd combination. So I believe in the liberal arts. I believe in boys' education. And what we're going to talk about, I think, here at the end of the Republic is I'll wait. It's good. I'll wait. It's all right. It's a little, I know it's early. Is basically a couple of lessons from the books I've written. As Philip said, I've written about Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, Andrew Jackson, Thomas Jefferson, and George Herbert Walker Bush, who, by the way, is being released from the hospital this weekend. And I had an email from Mrs. Bush yesterday, I guess. She said, he thinks he's going to do the coin toss at the Super Bowl. Period. We'll see. period. So everyone's in character. He's still going, and she's still watching closely. So thankfully, they're both out of the hospital after a scare. He's 92, she's 91. They've been married for 72 years. I was when I was out talking about the book last year, they were at that point, it was 71 years, and I said they've been married for 71 years, and there was a man down front sitting with his wife at this event, and he said, "Jesus Christ!" I said, "You got a long ride home, buddy. You know, that's tough." So it's an eclectic group, but there are some common themes, obviously. I write about politicians because I believe in politics. It's the only way we have to conduct our public affairs. Aristotle saw this. And I admire people who take the risk of judgment and go into the arena. There's no other way to do it. It's very hard. It gets ever harder. I think we're living through a moment where the level of difficulty is being accelerated in a way that we really can't judge quite yet. That's not a partisan point. Whether you are for the 45th President of the United States or against him, there's no question but that he has changed the nature of certainly the electoral process and arguably the governing process. He's actually kind of the id right now of the presidency, the open synapse, because I promise every president since 1896, when Adolph Ox bought the New York Times, has wanted to do what Donald Trump did this morning, which is tweet out that the New York Times is unfair to him. They've all wanted to say it. He just has the means and the disposition to say so publicly. So my view is, as Mark Twain once said, history may not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And so I wanted to run through a couple of these lessons from my folks that I hope are lessons that I can give my own children. I have the 14-year-old, I have a 12-year-old girl who's really 30, and an 8-year-old. And they come out of each of these books. My theory of biography, quickly, is that we learn more if we don't look up at the past adoringly or down on it condescendingly. But if we try to look it in the eye, take it for what it was, judge them morally, not by our standards, but by the standards of that age. Were there voices of reform that they ignored? When it comes to Andrew Jackson, for instance, frankly, there was not, and it's a national source of national shame as opposed to individual shame. There were not strong voices defending, arguing against the removal of Native Americans. He was on the extreme edge of the mainstream in 1830, 31, 32, but he wasn't outside the mainstream. And there's a reflexive tendency to want to blame a singular figure or hold a singular figure to account in a way that exculpates all of us. That's wrong, because remember, presidents are far more often mirrors of the national will than they are makers, and the great ones truly become makers of it. So here are some lessons from each of these. One is curiosity. I wrote about Thomas Jefferson, which was totally fascinating because he himself was so fascinating. When I was out talking about that book, I would get a lot of people saying, "Oh, I'm really a Hamiltonian," which meant they were an investment banker. That's what that means. And by the way, if anyone has any lyrics for a Thomas Jefferson rap musical, I'll be outside right afterward. When I got Chris Christie, whom I know a little bit, before he became Patty Hearst. Can't you see him with that machine gun in front of the flag? Invited me to have lunch in Trenton, and I'm delighted to do it. So I went out. We were sitting in his office, and he said, "Well, I'm really more of a Hamilton guy." And I said, "Well, that's great, Governor, but at least my guy didn't get shot in Jersey." And the damnedest thing happened. I couldn't get back into the city. The bridge was blocked. That's an unknown part of that story. But Thomas Jefferson was able to do what Thomas Jefferson did because he was intellectually curious. My argument about Jefferson is that he was constantly a political creature. If you're looking for philosophical consistency, don't look to politicians. Look to philosophers, look to pastors, look to teachers. But politicians are living in a world, as George Eliot once put it, of dim lights and tangled circumstance. And so Jefferson was a political man for 40 years, except for 4 years he was either seeking political office or holding it. For 36 of 40 years as well, from 1800 to 1840, either Thomas Jefferson himself or a self-described Jeffersonian was president of the United States. That's an unmatched political dynasty. Lincoln didn't do it, FDR didn't do it, Reagan didn't do it. But he got to that place and was able to do what he did because he read constantly. He spent too much money on books. Amazon Prime would have been his doom. He died hugely in debt, partly because he bought books all the time. And that intellectual curiosity fundamentally shaped the world in which we live, because he was in conversation with the big ideas of those preceding 2 or 3 centuries. So what was going on in the world, in the Western world, in the 2 or 3 centuries before the American Revolution? The Protestant Reformations, the shift from the rise of Gutenberg, the rise of the bourgeoisie, the shift from the idea that society is organized vertically from princes and prelates and priests and kings to all of us. That we, in fact, were born with an ability and a right to determine our own destiny, not simply to follow the dictates of an office that was inherited by birth or won by appointment. That shift from horizontal to vertical was the great intellectual shift of the Enlightenment era. And Jefferson was totally in tune with that, largely because of a man named William Small, whom I doubt many of you have ever heard of, but arguably plays with John Witherspoon, who taught Madison, and Aaron Burr and others, one of the great roles in American life, because he was Thomas Jefferson's exposure and introduction to the ideas of both the European and the Scottish Enlightenment. He was teaching at William and Mary in the 1760s. He was only there for about 5 years, and fortunately that intersected with Jefferson, who was there. And he was a Scottish intellectual who had come over to make money as a professor in the New World, went back shortly thereafter, was loyal to Britain. We have some correspondence with Jefferson after that. But Jefferson was schooled in these ideas, this shifting idea of equality, limited in its way, of course, but that there was, in fact, a larger intellectual shift, a larger cultural shift going on. And in many ways, I'd argue the American Revolution is the political manifestation of that intellectual shift from vertical to horizontal. And so that curiosity, I think, is a virtue that our greatest political leaders have had. FDR had it. Ronald Reagan, in his way, had it. He was one of the reasons Reagan became Reagan is when he went to work for GE in 1954 as a corporate spokesman. He was scared of flying, and so he rode the train everywhere to do all these speeches. He spoke to 30,000 people a year at GE plants all over the country. And how did he while away the hours on those train rides? But reading books, after 1955, National Review. He was a charter subscriber to Bill Buckley's magazine. And one of the reasons also that Reagan was not a terrific actor as opposed to a movie star is he had a photographic memory. And anything he read never left, even if it was wrong. So if he read that trees created pollution because somebody had misunderstood carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide, which I do all the time, it would stick in there and it would come out. And so Dick Darman, who was his staff secretary in the first term as president, when Reagan was president, was actually incredibly careful about what he gave Reagan. Because if you gave him anything, it would be there forever. And but that curiosity, those hours on the train were hugely important. So I think an intellectual curiosity is critical to political leadership. I hope my kids end up having it. The second is, and this seems sort of cliched, I suppose, but just simple courage. And this is something that has a great deal of resonance right now. The most powerful man in the world is not unwilling at this hour to personally take on those who criticize him. And so it requires a certain kind of courage to protest and to stand up. Again, that's a supra-partisan point. It's just simply a reality. But Winston Churchill is so identified with courage that we almost, as Linus once said in Peanuts, he was reading The Brothers Karamazov, and Lucy asked him, "How do you pronounce all those Russian names?" And he said, "Oh, I don't. I just bleep over them." So Churchill, we kind of bleep over because he's so large. But it's worth thinking about him for a second. This is a boy who was not a particularly strong student at Harrow, went to Sandhurst because his father didn't think he was smart enough for Oxford or Cambridge, was considered, as he once put it, so dumb that he was not allowed to learn Latin. He simply learned English, which sort of helped us in the end. After a particularly long and liquid, which is redundant in the Churchill case, dinner one night with his own son, he said, "You and I have now spent more time talking tonight than I spent talking to my father in my whole life." He grew up with this heroic vision, but incredibly distant relationship with both his mother and his father. And decided, I think, in that emotional bleakness, that he would replace a familial dynamic, a familial affection, with a national one. And had an imaginative vision of Britain and its role in the world that benefited all of us enormously when the crisis came in 1940. Now, it's important to remember, when you think about Churchill's courage, to remember that if he had been hit by a car in 1939, the obituary probably would have made the New York Times because of his familial connections. But he would have been seen as someone who had been woefully wrong about almost everything. He'd been wrong about the gold standard. He was wrong about India. He had sided with Edward VIII in the crisis over the crown, which is now back because of the new Dickens, Netflix. And I consider Netflix, parenthetically, the great competition for books in the new era. Because Netflix does prove that Milton Friedman was right. If you deregulate, you will have a more creative economy. It's kind of amazing when you think about it. Once the network gatekeepers were removed and people could get out there, this amazing golden era of television. And now you have, on airplanes, which is where I spend most of my life, I used to be able to see what was really selling well in bookstores by walking up and down the aisle, but now everyone's doing what? They're watching their phones. So, and you can't really be snobbish about it because 13 or 26 hours of some of these shows are amazing. It is the new novel in many ways. So, anyway, Churchill had been wrong about so many things. And when he was called to be prime minister on the 10th of May, 1940, he was 65 years old. Now, it's worth thinking for a moment. Why did the king have to send for a 65-year-old as opposed to, say, a 50 or 45-year-old, which would have been more common? Because they were all dead because of the Great War. There were very few young to middle-aged Tories in the House of Commons in 1940. So Churchill was finally called. He goes to the palace, and as he put it later, he left. He said, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and all my life had been but preparation for this hour and for this trial. I was sure I should not fail." He was, at that point, the only person who was sure he would not fail. When Franklin Roosevelt was told that Churchill had become prime minister, the note came to him on Friday afternoon. FDR used to hold cabinet meetings on Friday afternoon, which I guess would be like holding faculty meetings. It was sort of make sure everybody would work all week. And because of the time difference, which is I'm not in favor of, because of the time difference, Roosevelt was handed this note in the cabinet room. And he read it, that Churchill had become prime minister, and he said out loud, "Well, I suppose Winston is the best man England has, even if he is drunk half the time." So this didn't begin on a particularly good note. But because I think of this again, emotional connection to the nation that in many ways I believe in his life replaced that to his family. Because in some ways the country was more real to him. Politics was more real to him than his own family was because he'd spent more time with it. He was elected to the House of Commons in 1900. He was 26 years old, not even 25. He was elected before Victoria died. He took his seat right after she died. He'd been in the House, in 1915, 16, he had been the architect of the attacks at Gallipoli, which was so disastrous. He thought his life was over. He resigned, and he went to the front at age 40. He rejoined his old regiment and actually went to France and fought in the First World War. Again, parenthetically, at some point, someone needs to write, and maybe already has, a great dissertation about what it is about the age of 40 that creates so many important crises in life. Dante was 40 when he was in a dark wood wandering. Churchill had this crisis at age 41. Franklin Roosevelt was afflicted with polio at age 38. Bill Clinton lost a race when he was 40 that shaped the rest of his life. Ronald Reagan's career went onto the rocks at age 40. George Herbert Walker Bush lost a Senate race and had lost a daughter. There's something about that number. I don't mean to be too numerological, but there is a midlife moment of crisis in so many of these lives. What Churchill did was, without being romantic or grandiose about it, is he simply looked across the channel and said that Hitler had gone that far and would go no farther. And this is not romantic, it's not mythic, it's what happened. We have the minutes from the cabinet meetings where this man sat there and said, if we are to die, let us die choking on our own blood in the streets of London. And at that point, the rest of Europe had folded. France was burning its papers in the Croix d'Orsay. Franklin Roosevelt was paying too much attention to American public opinion, which was decidedly against. Charles Lindbergh was still an enormously important figure in a movement, to reach for a phrase we haven't heard in a while, America first. So I think the immensity of that achievement is sometimes, again, I think we kind of skip over it. Because then ultimately Roosevelt comes in, Stalin, Hitler turns on Stalin, the war gets more complicated. But in those 19, 20 months, that single man, that little boy who hadn't been particularly loved or attended to, was the one who stood between us and the barbarians. And that courage, that ability to do that, is something that we have to. Often it's not summoned until we actually need it. It's hard to know sometimes who has it. But it's as Aristotle said, it is the singular most important virtue because it guarantees all the others. And particularly when I talk to younger folks about this, I think it's important to remember that Churchill was so broken and so human, because then they can see that they can do it too. One of the problems actually with great monuments, with the Lincoln Memorial, with the Jefferson Memorial, with the King Memorial now that looks across at Jefferson, I love that. It's not commented on enough. But in Washington today, you have Martin Luther King staring down Thomas Jefferson. That's a good way of looking at American history. And when you commemorate, when you memorialize, when you make these figures literally larger than life, there's a risk that they begin to lose the capacity to teach because they become heroic and not human. But these folks were all men before they were monuments. And I think the more historians, biographers, headmasters can teach that, can teach the fact that a John Lewis could change the world, that Martin Luther King, who had like John Kennedy, like Franklin Roosevelt, like almost everybody, had a very complicated spousal relationship, had appetites and ambitions that were fulfilled in sometimes conventionally, morally inconvenient ways. But they were human, they did great things. in the battle between light and dark, in all of us, at least in me, I don't want to throw y'all in with me, but for me, the battle between light and dark, if I can get to 51-49 for the light, that's a good day. And I don't always. There are not a lot of landslides in that battle. And I think I'm on fairly safe ground, given the history of the world since Eden, to say that that's fairly common. And so if you can get to 51-49, if an Abraham Lincoln, who's in his first inaugural, says that slavery is totally safe in states where it currently exists, gets from there to the Emancipation Proclamation in 2 years, not necessarily because of moral considerations, but because of military ones. He needed to activate, he needed to encourage the enslaved populations to rise up against the Confederate troops in what he was beginning to call hard war, by which he meant total war, the idea that civilians were now part of the war effort in a way that they had not been in the 18th century, and that we've seen ever since. You know, if someone like Lincoln is at 51-49, then of course the rest of us are too. So the courage of a Churchill, the courage of a Lincoln to get to that point, I think is a remarkably important virtue. The last is, and this is about George H.W. Bush, with whom I spent about 20 years doing this. It's been about 20 years. I interviewed him for 9. It was a little bit like interviewing Dana Carvey sometimes, not gonna do it, I called Dana when I was doing this and I said, how did you build that impression? And Dana said, oh, it was easy. You just do Mr. Rogers trying to be John Wayne, which is actually kind of perfect, unleash orgy of death. And also for me to interview George Bush was a little bit like the world's least effective wasp-on-wasp therapy. We would get close to an emotional truth, and then we'd decide to go have lunch. It was a complicated relationship. But of the living presidents, and we have about 15 of them right now. We actually have more now than we've ever had, except for a brief period in the middle of the 19th century. George Bush has more in common culturally and temperamentally, really, with the founding fathers than he does with his contemporaries. He's the last president of the World War II generation, first president of the post-Cold War era. He's someone who entirely shaped by institutions like the ones you represent, Greenwich Country Day School, Andover, Yale, the United States Navy. He was the youngest flying officer in the Navy, won the Distinguished Flying Cross on his 18th birthday, June 12th, 1942. He did 3 things. He turned 18, he graduated from Andover, and he drove from Andover to Boston and took the oath as a naval enlistee. Went to aviation school in Chapel Hill in Minneapolis. On September 2nd, 1944, he's flying a mission over Chichijima and the Bonin Islands. He has 2 crewmen right behind him, but a steel shaft dividing them in this torpedo bomber, very slow, clunky kind of plane. He's supposed to take out a radio tower. He goes in, heavy Japanese flak. The plane is hit, the wings go up in flames, the cockpit fills with smoke, but he keeps going. He hits the tower, he does his duty, and he goes back out. He realizes the plane's not going to make it. He tells the 2 guys to hit the silk to get out, to bail out. He moves the plane to the position he's supposed to. He hopes they've done that. Then he bails out. And at that point, the story almost ended, because if you think about it, when you bail out of an airplane, the airplane doesn't stop. So the tail of the plane hit him right here as he went out, and another 6 or 8 inches, and he probably would have been decapitated. So he plunges deep into the sea. Miraculously, his life raft, which had fallen off his uniform, has landed near him. He flops on it. He's out there for about 4 hours. If the wind and the tide had blown him toward the island as opposed to outward, he would have become a prisoner of war. And we later found out that Chichijima was the site of particularly horrific war crimes, including cannibalism. So when President Bush, and this is a very bold domestic maneuver, whenever he was in some hot water with Mrs. Bush, he would say, but Bar, I could have been an hors d'oeuvre, which is a pretty bold place to go when you think about it. When you play the cannibalism card, That's a man who deserved to have ultimate authority in a nuclear age, I think. And he was 20 years old when all this was happening. I think we've lost a sense of this, of how young and how formative those experiences were. We've mythologized it too much, arguably. But Philip was with us. We went down to a group from MBA and from Harpeth Hall, went down to the 75th anniversary of Pearl Harbor at the President's Library in College Station. And there was a group of guys who'd been at Pearl Harbor. And President Bush and Bob Dole was there, whom I'd forgotten how funny he was. And he called, we had a funny phone conversation afterward. And, he talks like this, Bob Dole. He always talked, he was the first one who referred to himself in the third person as president. Bob Dole says, he said, Bob Dole, he said, that was fun down there. The president and I, we were enemies, hated each other's guts, but then we became fast friends. Well, maybe not so fast, but friends. He said that being a lawyer now, working for a law firm, as he put it, it's like being in Congress. You show up, you don't do anything, you get paid, it's great. But here's a man who was shot in Sicily, charging a German machine gun nest, had lost use of his arm, obviously. The night before the event at dinner, so it's like Adams and Jefferson, right? They ran against each other twice, in 1980 and 88. No love lost. They were about as different as they could be in terms of the American experience. Here's a poor boy from Russell, Kansas, whose family had to move into the basement of their house during the Depression, and George H.W. Bush, who once joked to Ronald Reagan about the Depression that the Bushes had to reuse tennis balls. It's just the way that was. But they were brought together by what? By combat, by the experience of the war. And I'm convinced that George Bush would not have been president without the World War II experience, not because of the heroic story I just told you, but because he knew who those guys were. He was a censor for the mail, for the enlisted men. And it was an entire education for him in what real people were like, because he'd lived in this isolated world. And all of that led to, in many ways, the virtue that I think is so important with him, which is empathy. He was the most empathetic man, is the most empathetic man I've ever known. And I include everybody in my own life. He is always thinking about, as he puts it, the other guy. And there was a direct, part of it was innate. His brother told me he thought it was innate. He said, Poppy, which was his childhood nickname, Poppy just was always like this. He was known as half Bush, because whenever he had a candy bar or a cookie, he would cut it in half and give it to whoever he was with. Bruce Gelb, who was later an ambassador, heir to the Clairol fortune, was being bullied at Andover, was being sort of crammed into a corner by some older boys with a couch somehow. And Gelb thought, this is it. And he heard this young lad's voice say, "Leave the kid alone." And instantly these boys fell back. And Gelb asked, "Who was that?" And the bully said, "That was Poppy Bush. He just saved you." At Greenwich Country Day School, there was an annual obstacle course race, and which had little barrels and all sorts of things. And Bush always won it, just sort of predictably won every year. And so much so that they kept him back and made him sort of as a handicap. He had to wait 20 seconds or something. So he starts off, everybody else has gone off, and he's doing his thing. And he looks over when he's going through a barrel, and he sees that in the next barrel, one of his severely overweight classmates, Bennett McNichol, was stuck in the barrel. So Bush stops, pulls McNichol out, and so as not to embarrass him by beating him, then just runs at his pace all the way around and finishes the race. I heard that story, by the way, not from the Bush world, but from one of Bennett McNichol's children. And I asked the president at one point, interviewing him, I said, why did you do that? And he looked at me truly as if I were crazy and said, well, I'd never been stuck in a barrel, but if I had been, I'd want somebody to pull me out. You idiot, which is basically what he was saying. but there was this sense of how does the other person feel? How do you make them feel better? Direct line from that personal characteristic to the diplomacy that shaped the world we live in. When the Berlin Wall fell on the 9th of November, 1989, George Mitchell, Dick Gephardt, the press, everybody started yelling about how Bush should go to Berlin and declare a great American victory in the Cold War, the defining struggle of 40 years with the threat of Armageddon always at hand. And Bush said no. And he didn't say no, as his critics said, because he didn't understand the poetry of the occasion or the significance of it. This is a man, again, who had been shot out of the sky and had served as a congressman, ambassador to the United Nations, director of the CIA, envoy to China, and vice president of the United States for 8 years, where every morning he was handed a card with the nuclear codes, which, in the absence of the president, he could unleash the entire American nuclear arsenal with no check whatever. He understood what had just happened, but his mind was not on himself and us and our victory, it was on Gorbachev, because he knew that Gorbachev, who was trying to reform the Soviet Union at that point, had immense problems on his right flank. He had all these bitter-ender Soviet extremists, great Russia types, gee, what does that remind us of, who he knew would be inflamed if the American president showed up and, as he put it, danced on the wall. And so he took the heat from people like me and others who were kicking him in the shins about how he didn't understand the significance of it, because he had empathetically realized that it was in Gorbachev's interest, and therefore in the interests of the United States and the Western world, to let Gorbachev have that breathing room. He understood what the other person was experiencing. And I firmly believe that the reason the Cold War ended largely without a single shot being fired is because this boy who pulled Benedict McNichol out of the barrel was pulling Mikhail Gorbachev out of a lot of barrels in that critical 4-year period. So those are the three characteristics, curiosity and courage and empathy. I know it sounds pat, but so was the Sermon on the Mount when you think about it. I want to leave you with this. This is the George Bush that I got to know, and that I would hope we're all raising those over whom we have influence. The Bushes lost a daughter to leukemia in 1953. She was 4 years old, Robin Bush, and Mrs. Bush had noticed that she was sluggish in January. Jeb had just been born in January, so February, March, she was dealing with the baby. She realizes Robin is bruising easily. And they take her to the pediatrician in Midland, Texas. The pediatrician is crying when she says that the best they can do is just take her home and make her comfortable, that she'll be gone in a few months. George Bush, being George Bush, a man who was always running, always looking forward, he was so frenetic, in fact, that at one point in the 1980 campaign, in campaigning in New Hampshire, he shook the hand of a department store mannequin as he was working through a department store. Now, Lyndon Johnson would have tried to register that mannequin, and God knows what Bill Clinton might have done. But anyway, George Bush, being George Bush, goes outside, calls his uncle, who's the head of Sloan Kettering, Dr. John Walker, wonderful man, had polio, brilliant surgeon. And Dr. Walker said, bring her up here, we'll do what we can. And they got 6 or 8 months. She died over the Columbus Day weekend in 1953. And this is a letter, part of a letter, that was found in President Bush's mother's papers after she died in 1992. It was written in the late 50s. At this point, George W., who'd been born in 46, Jeb, born in 53, Marvin and Neil had been born in the mid-50s. Doro, their second daughter, had not yet been born. She was born in 59. So this was, we think it was 57, 58. He's writing from Texas. This is the voice of George Bush. There is about our house a need. The running, pulsating restlessness of the 4 boys needs a counterpart. We need some starched crisp frocks to go with all our torn-kneed blue jeans and helmets. We need some soft blonde hair to offset those crew cuts. We need a dollhouse to stand firm against our forts and rackets and 1,000 baseball cards. We need someone who could sing the descant to Alouette. We need a legitimate Christmas angel, one who doesn't have cuffs beneath the dress. We need someone who's afraid of frogs. We need someone to cry when I get mad, not argue. We need a little one who can kiss without leaving egg or jam or gum. We need a girl. We had one once. She'd fight and cry and play and make her way just like all the rest. But there was about her a certain softness. She was patient. Her hugs were just a little less wiggly. She'd stand beside our bed till I felt her there. Silently and comfortable, she'd put those precious fragrant locks against my chest and fall asleep. Her peace made me feel strong and so very important. My daddy had a caress, a certain ownership, which touched a slightly different spot than the hi dad I love so much. But she is still with us. We need her and yet we have her. We can't touch her and yet we can feel her. We hope she'll stay in our house for a long, long time. In the course of interviewing him, I asked him to read that letter aloud to me, and we were sitting in his office in Houston, and the door was open. And long before he finished, he broke down with an extraordinary level of physical sobbing. So much so that his chief of staff, whose office was next door, heard him and came in. And she saw what we were doing, and she said, "Why did you want President Bush to read that?" And I said, "Well, if you want to know someone's heart," and before I could finish, the president interrupted and said, "You have to know what breaks it." Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you. You have any questions I could dodge? Yes, sir. Oh God, all of them. Yeah, I was giving the men some time. It's a fascinating question because I'm writing about one of them. I'm doing a biography of both Dolly and James Madison because without her, the Republic itself would not have taken the shape it did. She did the most that was possible given the constraints of that era to build the Republican social space. She's the architect of a Washington that works in many ways. She was functionally the most powerful woman in America from 1800 to 1816, because Jefferson's wife was dead. He didn't bring anyone to Washington. The Madisons, Madison was Secretary of State. They had a house on F Street that was sort of the center of things. So she's one. I think arguably the most important married couple of the 20th century were Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. She was his liberal conscience when everything all of his instincts were to build workable majorities, and that meant dealing with Democrats from my native South, who at that point were ferocious segregationists. So Mrs. Roosevelt is certainly there. Tennessee plays an important role. We were the tip-over state for the suffrage amendment. I don't know enough about the suffrage movement. I actually looked at it to possibly write about it and realized I had no particular insights except that my daughters tell me what to do to write about it. But of course there are. My issue is because I'm a political biographer, we're going to have to wait a little while longer, obviously, to have people at the highest levels. Probably not very long, I suspect, but yeah, I thought that 12 weeks ago, too, so. Yes, sir. Then we'll come to Cleveland. The ambassador from Cleveland is here, yeah.
So, having seen so many of these lives, what do you see as the most significant events and experiences or circumstances that children need to go on to greatness?
Adversity. And I don't know about your constituencies, but, my children's idea of adversity is, if the pizza is late, that's rough. Starbucks out of bagels. So there's not much hope. But I've actually made that joke before. If you're raising normal children, they're not going to be talked about after they're gone. And I wish that were not true. But when you look at the big figures who really bent history, they all had significant passages of adversity. President Roosevelt, who was born the only and beloved son of a doting mother, remember, whose bedroom is between Franklin and Eleanor's at Hyde Park. I know you all think you have difficult mother-in-laws. Try that one. Goes off to Groton, goes to Harvard, stays at Harvard an extra year to edit the Crimson, goes to Columbia Law School, was, totally adversity-free. Was the vice presidential nominee in 1920. People forget that. He was sort of the Dan Quayle of his era, sort of attractive and not particularly, I like Vice President Quayle. I won't make the easy joke. There's an E on joke. So I did. So I sinned. Forgive me. And he wasn't particularly interesting. Then in 1939, after he goes to a Boy Scout camp in Maine on his way to Campobello, he wakes up and can't walk, and becomes the Franklin Roosevelt who saves the world. Here's just a fun fact for you. You all probably know this, but you know how old Franklin Roosevelt was when he died? 63. Isn't that amazing? I mean, it's just our sense of age changes. At least mine does as I get closer to 63. But to have done what he did, to have won 4 presidential elections, to have fought a global war, to have saved capitalism from itself, was remarkable. And it was because he had to deal with polio. And Churchill dealt with emotional deprivation. And it doesn't have to be so novelistic and so vivid, but I think making things hard for them in this climate is really important. There's a teacher at MBA whom I revere because she is the first person who is sort of, at least in my son's life, who's gone to St. Bernard's in New York and a local little lower school, and then loves it here. But there's a woman who teaches math who actually talks to them the way they should be talked to. Our favorite one is, if they're not, I'll just throw my son under the bus. If he's not particularly firing on all pistons, she'll say, "Oh, we're all on the mountaintop and you're in the valley," or "You're going to be a garbage man," and it's just, and the boys thrill to it because it's just such a clear behavioral reaction, And our guy's like a rat in a maze. If you tell him where the cheese is, he'll go get it. It's very, he dislikes English because he doesn't understand. If there's not a finite answer, it's a little concerning. But I think you tell these stories about how people who were flawed, who were driven by appetite and ambition, and who had difficulty, and that they're the ones who did it, who made a difference. And then hope that they overcome whatever the struggle is in their own life. The ambassador from Cleveland.
As a biographer of figures that are not living, I would imagine you glean much information as to the type of person they were through letters, journals, diaries.
Exactly.
So as we move forward, where will future historians get insight with the age of Twitter and text and email? Where will that come from?
It's a great question, and I actually think that we have the opposite problem. Now, with the incumbent, I don't think there's going to be a lot of a paucity of materials. I think we're going to be okay there. I interviewed Mr. Trump in last May. Spent about an hour with him in Trump Tower, and it was like interviewing the Admiral and Mary Poppins. You know, he was like firing off cannons and wearing hats. It was just totally surrealistic. And I walked in, I swear to God, and he said, it's an honor to be with you. You know, I've never read your books, but you're great on TV. You know, and I actually kind of appreciated that, because I've known Secretary Clinton for a long time, and if I had been talking to her, she would have said, oh, your Jefferson book explained X to me in a way I'd never, and I would know she was lying, and you know, she would know I knew she was lying, and we would be part of this establishmentarian fiction, and we'd all feel better. Trump had no interest in that. He actually meant that he had never read one of these books. He said, yeah, I heard you writing about George Bush. I thought, not a lot of sex there. You know, and again, that's true, you know. No sex, please, we're wasps. But, so anyway, he's not exactly an opaque figure. On other people, there's actually, it's going to be like Hoover's FBI, to some extent. There's actually going to be more, but it's going to be like trying to find BBs in a quail after you've shot a quail. You're clearly in the South. Because the email is preserved, but it's like having telephone transcriptions of telephone conversations. I mean, imagine reading your emails trying to reconstruct a decision you made. I mean, it's going to be really, really hard. And so in a way, we're going to be, in the way Hoover gathered too much information about everyone, in a way we're going to have this sort of tsunami of data points, and it's going to be harder to get to the essence of it. Really starting with George W. Bush. And the letters, you know, the letters are critical, and nobody writes them. And so it's going to make it harder. I'll be dead by then, so it'll be all right. Yes, sir.
Hi, John. I've got to know we met some years ago through John Lewis and my friend.
Oh, of course. Were we at Solani together?
Yes.
Yes.
I wasn't Swanee, but I'll tell you later.
Okay.
I have a question. You were clearly an establishment person in New York City. Why return to the South?
Well, I sobered up. An establishment person, I like that. Grass and dogs, literally. My son was, I guess, 9 then, and he walked in. I was working on Jefferson, and he said, "There's nothing to do in a New York apartment at 4:30 on a Friday afternoon," and I couldn't argue with him. We just wanted to have a house and be back here. My wife's from Mississippi. Don't hold that against me too much. She's a recovering Mississippian. The only sense in which she married up was marrying a Tennessean. That's it, you know. She learned about hardback books and electricity and asphalt, and it's great. It was a big moment for everybody. So she's not here, obviously. We wanted to, I was focusing on writing more than editing, and so that, blessedly, you can do that anywhere. Arthur Schlesinger was one of our neighbors, wonderful man. I miss him all the time. He died the way we should all die, which is on his second martini in a New York steakhouse. That's the way I hope to go. You know, he said the great thing about being a historian is you can do it anywhere. And we wanted to be here, and it wasn't necessarily a slam dunk that it was going to be great, but we haven't had a bad day. It's been 5 years, and we love it. So we're very we have gone from a state which, as you know, is as blue as it gets, to one in which the incumbent president carried 92 out of 95 counties. So that's been different. So yes, sir. You'll get well.
I have a question about substance of your talk, and it might actually turn into just a request for a comment rather than a specific question. Courage, curiosity, and empathy. Courage has been a highly admired virtue since the ancient Greeks. Curiosity, arguably, is perhaps a little more recent, but it wouldn't have been unfamiliar to someone in the 19th or 20th century. But empathy is a big new word in our world.
Interesting.
The world of educators, and particularly folks who are thinking about character education. I was wondering if you could just comment in general about that virtue and its role in the world that our boys are going to be entering when they graduate from our schools?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't realize it was a new word. That's sort of scary.
It's not a word, but it's, did this conference 50 years ago with this group of educators in these schools? We're not talking about that.
Right, right. Well, I guess I have two instant thoughts that are worth the amount of time I can think about it. One is, I think that it's the action plan for what I'm sure each of your schools teaches in a moral sense, right? I mean, it's the action plan for a golden rule. If you love your neighbor as yourself, which is by and large, an impossible standard. The only person I know who actually comes close to it is John Lewis. Literally, I mean that. I mean, he was willing to die in the streets for other people, and is as close to a genuine Christian martyr as existed in contemporary American life. So that's empathy in action. Unlike, despite what Bobby Kennedy said about how if once one man stands up, it creates a movement. I actually think I have a more tragic view of this, that most of us are not given, this is a middle Marchian view, most of us are not given the kind of epic stage and epic scale in which to be a John Lewis or a Franklin Roosevelt or a Winston Churchill. But we can, by the smaller acts of kindness and of empathy, we can ameliorate and soften the edges of the public life wherever we are. And so I guess it seems to me to be inextricably linked to any kind of character curriculum, because we're judged, ultimately it seems to me you have to judge character. The only way to judge character is on its manifestation, right? I mean, because you can't, as Elizabeth I said, we can't make windows into their souls. You can't do an MRI and see if you succeeded in teaching them character. The only way to judge it is by action and by manifestation, right? I think I'm right about that. So empathy, it seems to me, is I mean, almost, it is character. It's the manifestation of character, because how else do you judge it? How else, either by being kind to others, by giving them a chance to shine, by standing in a way that elevates them in the hope that a rising tide lifts all of us. Without that action, I don't see how you can judge whether you have inculcated or shaped character at all. Does that help? Do you want me to push me on that if you want? I mean, I'm just guessing. I mean, the word itself is kind of a little soft, I guess. I mean, one of the, people, Bill Clinton, actually 92 was really when it became a political thing. Remember, Bill Clinton was empathetic against this seemingly buttoned up, George H.W. Bush. One of the ironies of history, though, and one of the ironies of character is Clinton said, "I feel your pain." Bush did. He just couldn't, because he had a sense of dignity, he didn't think it was appropriate to manifest it in those forums. But as I tried to show you, I mean, here's what's in that guy's heart and how it manifested itself. Yeah, it seems to me it's crucial to the ethos of it entirely. Will?
Before the conference, we sent a survey out that asked all the schools present here, what do you emphasize the most, and had a list of virtues. And everybody ranked them, and we're going to discuss that after this. And honor and integrity, as you might imagine for some of our schools, were kind of the most prevalent ones, especially the ones that we emphasize the most. Can you speak to those virtues in the political realm and what their relevance?
Yeah, I mean, honor bright, as Falstaff said. I think that I mean, honor is amorphous, right? It's a little bit like what Justice Stewart said about pornography. You know it when you see it. And in the current political context, you know, I can't answer it, so let me just present. This is the best way of thinking about it I can think of, and y'all answer it for yourselves. Let's say that a slightly outside the mainstream man is elected president, hypothetically. Someone who is unconventionally prepared and deals in the new media environment in a pugilistic way. Totally off the top of my head here. Just spitballing, as we say. And let's say that you're a center-right to centrist Republican, and you hold office in a border state that's shaped like this. Again, just spitballing. Let's say that you don't agree with what this incumbent, what this nominee is going to be like, but you are trying to figure out how do you best preserve your viability within a system to actually be in the arena to potentially oppose something he does down the road, right? So the question is, if you're a Republican, or I'll stop being clever. If you're a Republican who opposes Trump, is it the right thing to do, was it the right thing to do everything you could to speak out against him last year? Or, like a lot of people, do you keep your head down, go to that undisclosed location that Cheney left for you, and just see what happens? Because that's what a lot of people did. A lot of people that we know pretty well. Is that honorable? Was the honorable thing to say, this man does not have the temperament to be president, this man should not have that card every morning about the weapons, and to make that statement because it's what you believe, it's what your integrity leads you to do? Or is it dishonorable, therefore, to keep your head down, realize that your base is in an unsettled place, and that if you were to say that, you would lose your own capacity to ultimately try to curb what he does? Really fascinating question to me. It's sort of a gift of the Magi moment, in a way. I have enormous sympathy for a lot of my Republican friends who don't like this guy, who don't think this is right, but they didn't want her, and they're trying to figure out, you know, can they episodically oppose or support, you know, can you have a cafeteria kind of opposition? I don't know. I could make either case pretty compellingly, I think. And so, and I know people who've made both decisions. So honor is essential to everything, right? And also having the capacity to recover from moments that are dishonorable. I noticed on the way in on one of Brad's stones out here, Thomas Paine, what character is easier kept than recovered. I'm not sure that's true. I'm not sure but that's true of most of what Paine said. There was one more here. Sir?
Oh, I was...
I'll let y'all go.
Moved past, but I was making a comment, which is, you know, I found that interesting, your point, and I started reflecting on it. Why is it a new word when the golden rule and all these things that are similar to empathy have been around as long as we've been around? And I think maybe the problem is in the world of education is that it's new to us because it used to be taught at home. And it used to be something kids would come, especially from good families, already. And we didn't have to develop it. And so I think now, as we're thinking about how to develop character, which is also kind of a new thing, well, maybe not entirely new, but maybe you won't agree with me, and there's other teachers here, but I think the concept that we are having to be parents as well as teach and coach and do other things. So maybe that might be part of why you said that, but maybe I'm wrong.
That's really interesting. Y'all would know better. I mean, I'm, you know, in raging middle age. So, I mean, I went from when I was in this fascinates my son. When I was in the 7th grade at Macaulay in Chattanooga, I had his 7th grade history teacher who called pop quizzes Japs because it was a sneak attack. I mean, it was kind of like, hard to imagine, right? This is 1981. And we had this a bunch of these old World War II guys who were kind of refugees from the white flight academies around the South that had closed. We had lots of colonels and captains who, hadn't been. Lovely guy. I mean, I'm delighted. And the big thing was honor, truth, duty is the motto. And the sort of the motto of the school came from the first line of the shorter Westminster Catechism and the Presbyterians. What is man's chief end? Man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. And so that was drilled in. We wrote out the pledge on everything. We had chapel every day. And it was sort of a broad church kind of, I used to call it FCA Christianity. It was, if we pray hard enough, we'll beat Baylor. So there was not a lot of Augustinian nuance to the theology in the 7th grade. But I don't know about the in loco parentis thing. I'm trying to think, was I really raised all that differently? I mean, I guess what puzzles me about it, and maybe this is entirely a socioeconomic question, is we are so much more involved in our children's lives than my parents were, and I know than their parents were for them, that I hope, and maybe this is a reflection that we're not empathetic enough anyway, I would hope that actually that part would be easier for you. And I don't know if there's and I don't know, maybe the fact that we've softened all the guardrails for them, we've cushioned everything. Maybe that's made them less empathetic. I don't know. But I see what you mean about, let me ask you this. Have you seen a shift? How do y'all count generations? The Bible counts them in 21 years. Do y'all do it in, what? Is it 10 years? Is it 20? 12? Right, 12. So, I mean, have you seen a difference? I don't know how long you've been doing this.
Voice schools wouldn't talk about empathy 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Because it was girly?
Yeah, it was too much of a feminine term.
Really?
No question.
I think one reason that empathy comes up is sort of a reflection of the bullying culture, the certain American bullying culture, and for us, so there's the boys that we uphold as being the star boys, are confident, strong, like George Bush, but they lack that other piece to care about someone else. They just want to be on top, but they really don't care about anyone else. So I think that's where empathy comes in. Does anyone agree or disagree with that?
One of the things, we've both grown up with military people who were our coaches and our teachers and Sunday school teachers. And to me, one of the things I've seen is it seems to me that empathy is all about feelings for an individual or a group of individuals. And that when World War II was here, the individual didn't count except to the extent they could support the common cause to deal with the threat. Patton, I don't think anybody would refer to him as empathetic, but he had a character. And so I think that the further away we get from the national threat, then the more important the individual and their feelings and rights. So I think in some ways the reason that the empathy is a newer word, because we've gone so far from the threat of World War II and the Cold War to a point where we can celebrate and empathize with individuals as part of the whole, rather than diminishing them.
Interesting. There's one more thing to mention. Is at Jesuit schools, they always say a man for others or a boy for others. At Andover, their motto is non se vi, not for oneself alone. So I think we had an expression of this empathy, but in a different way. It's like that service to country, to others, is an aspect, I think, of empathy that you're maybe talking about. Maybe I should form that as a question, because you know.
No, you don't have to, obviously. And maybe this is why, somebody wrote 900 pages about this guy, because this is unusual. I do hear about Bush something I've never heard about anybody, really. And I've now heard it maybe 7, 8 times. People will have read the book and say something nice, or will say this just about them anyway, about both George and Barbara Bush. One of two things. One is, I would love to know them, which is interesting. You don't hear that about a lot of people. People want to meet a president, but to know them, it's an interesting choice of word. And the other thing, and I just had someone say this within the last 10 days, I can't remember where, but it was the third or fourth person who said, I would really like to be like George Bush. And I've really never heard anyone say that about another politician. And I was walking through an airport or something, I don't know where it was, but it was something that I said, oh, great, thank you. But then it sort of hit me 20 minutes later. That's a really unusual thing to say about a public person, that you would like to be like them. Because they didn't mean I'd like to do a bad budget deal. They didn't mean I'd like to reunify Germany. What they meant is they wanted to have these characteristics, feel these feelings. And Bush is interesting in that, I don't mean to say focus on him, but he's a prep school boy who, was educated and who's born in 24, so he's a product of the 30s on this. For someone who has been at the highest levels, he's the middle generation. His father was a senator, he was president, his son was president. For 70 years, his father went in the Senate in 1952. He's remarkably enemy-free. Nobody, in all these years of talking to everybody about this, no one ever said to me, George Bush in 1968 stabbed me in the back. Or, in 1977, he lied to me about X. Not a single person in all these years. And there was Bob Dole, again, sitting there with him. And Dole hated his guts because he had what he didn't have. But he did say, he beat me fair and square. So there is something about that honorable schoolboy ethos that I think works. And maybe it just was innate for him. I mean, he was drilled in modesty. His parents, his mother was, she said, don't use the first person pronoun. No one wants to hear about the great I am. He'd come home and say, I hit a double, and she'd say, how did the team do? She was a tough bird. But it's fascinating to me that this is something, at least in this formulation, that's new, because it feels so part and parcel of just to go all the way back to Aristotle, to be, if you're going to be in a social state, if you aren't empathetic, then you're on the road to Hobbes pretty fast, it seems to me.
Well, I think that it's been in schools and boys' schools for a long time, but I don't think we've been comfortable with the word.
Interesting.
And in fact, it's our theme this year.
Yeah.
So, but watching the boys' school world closely now for 25 years, the evolution is definitely shifting, and it wasn't there 25 years ago.
Very interesting.
Places like Andover and Yale were created then for the elite and for leadership in politics
Yeah.
and private world. We don't have that. So how do we prepare the next generation of leaders? And are schools really thinking about the character that's necessary to run the nation, to run the corporation, to run a university, to be a minister, to do all those leadership? How are we actually preparing the next generation?
Well, y'all would be able, everyone in this room is better qualified to answer that than I am. But that never having stopped me. I don't know that I agree. First of all, I mean, I'm on the board of Macaulay, And one sign of middle age is when your classmate becomes headmaster. You know, you just know it's all over. You're on the other side of the mountain. So my best friend growing up is now the headmaster at Macaulay. And he's obsessed with this. And spends a lot of time, you know, we've kicked it around. And I think it's choosing which models you hold up. I mean, actually, Philip should answer this. One of the things that's impressed me, and I haven't been at a lot of schools, but one of the things that's so interesting about the architecture here is what MBA has done is they have actually carved on the wall what they want people to be or think about. It's sort of like, all right, you're going to take these adolescent boys with the lizard brain and beat it over their heads, which is a very wise thing to do. So you're confronted with it. And it becomes not something that you talk about as a particular thing, but it becomes part of the ambient reality. It's a little bit like what, you know, great Roman Catholic cultures in those cities were in the, say, the 30s, 40s, and 50s, where saints' days and all that, that was just part of the air you breathed. I have friends who are very strong, now conservative Catholics, but who, what they really miss is the fact that they lived the life of the church. You know, they thought of themselves not as living in a neighborhood, but living in a parish. And because it was ambient, because it was just natural, it wasn't something they had to work very hard to think about. It is entirely revealing and somewhat dispiriting that you have to single out character education, right? I mean, if it were, I mean, Andover in the 30s, Dr. Fuess, you know, wouldn't have thought of that. It was just part of, again, the air you breathed. And for all the various reasons we all know about, you know, social change, it has become more difficult. You know, I think that one of the things and this is one thing I am qualified to say, one of the things that really does worry me about this particular national moment is my kids now, particularly the youngest one, will grow up with someone getting out of that helicopter and speaking. This is the anniversary, 31 years of the Challenger. Happened today. You know, Ronald Reagan went and gave that speech that Peggy Noonan wrote about reaching out to touch the face of God. It's just really hard for me to see this particular man doing that particularly well, fulfilling the pastoral and cultural role of the presidency. And maybe he will surprise me, and that's great. And I hope so. But it's going to be, you know, my other kids have grown up with George W. Bush, Barack Obama, who, whether you, again, hard to imagine two more different American men than the essentially fatherless son of a Kenyan man and a white woman from Kansas who grew up in Hawaii with George Walker Bush, you know, grandson of a senator, great-grandson of the most important investment banker in New York, son of a president. Hard to imagine two more different American stories, right? But they both executed the dignified element, as Bagehot said of the monarchy, the dignified element of the presidency, I would argue, pretty flawlessly. Obama did this beautifully. Mrs. Obama did this beautifully. The Bushes did this beautifully. This guy, we'll see. And I think it's gonna make your job harder. Maybe it makes it easier because you have a negative exemplum standing right there. But it's not a very good answer, but it's a reflection. Yes, sir.
On that note, the president's use of these scathing, undercutting epithets for so many people
Right.
is deeply disturbing. What do you make of that, and how, as an educator, do you counter that?
That's, thank God you all are doing it and not me. I don't know, because honestly, your diagnosis is exactly right. And the thing is, and there may be people here who are who are deeply sympathetic to him. And I think we have to, you can't only be for democracy when it turns out the way you want, right? It's like the First Amendment. You can't only be for it when you agree. But I think it can, I'd worry about a really corrosive effect. Again, my kids are a little different. I mean, they've spent time around both Bushes, under threat of death if they weren't nice. If we ever get hauled up on child abuse, it's going to be that. Actually, I paid them once $5 for every time they said Mr. President. And like the 8-year-old, bought a phone. Mr. President, can I have some more macaroni and cheese? That kind of thing. So I admit that I'm kind of an outlier on this. But I think you've got somebody who has shown almost no public empathy. Privately, he can. I've experienced it. I know people who have. I also know people who were friends of his for 30 years, whom he would then screw in a real estate deal for like 50 grand. That's a story I know quite well from someone. You ask almost any big businessman in New York, would you have done business with this guy 2 years ago? And the answer is no. Because he didn't pay his bills. I mean, all that stuff's true. Okay, so there's that. But then there's also the reality that in a political moment where only 17% of the American people trust the federal government, down from 77% in 1965. So think about that, your generational point. That's dropped 60 points. And the other thing, the reason Donald Trump is president, I'm firmly convinced, is because the number that the White House under Joe Biden, under a task force, believes is a household income number that enables you to live a middle-class life in a traditional post-World War II sense, is $135,000. Where you have a family of 4, the grown-ups have a car, you save a little bit, you go on vacation. As you all know, the household income in the United States is $57,500. In that 60 points of failing trust in government, and in that missing 70 grand or whatever it is, Donald Trump has stepped in. And it's very hard, as part of the establishment, for somebody like me to say with any intellectual honesty that the Bush, Clinton, almost cartel of leadership would be able to move those numbers, because they presided over those numbers. I totally get the populist political forces that have produced this. What I don't get is why so many people why no one's been able to get to him and say, you're here, you can still keep the folks happy, without calling this morning the New York Times fake news. I don't really see what that got him, except that it keeps probably folks in the 92 out of 95 counties here fairly okay. He believes in politics and culture as total war. It's the Roy Cohn vision, right? And that was his lawyer. His lawyer was Roy Cohn. It's all, you can't make it up. And every great political leader masters the means of communication of their time. So Roosevelt and Churchill and Hitler mastered the radio. John Kennedy and Ronald Reagan mastered television. Trump speaks in the vernacular of social media and reality TV, and it's both. It's not just the Twitter. He understands the pacing and drama of reality TV. And one of the things I realized is sitting around at dinner in October is that nobody I was talking to had ever seen The Apprentice. Right? Because it's kind of a class thing, to be honest. I have a theory, by the way, you're the first people I'm inflicting this theory on, except for my son. My son is so obsessed with politics that when he gets in the car here, it's like being in the green room at hardball. I mean, I just immediately have to start talking. And somehow or another, he knows all the outrageous things that have happened in the course of a day. But I think the reason Trump hasn't put anything on the desk in the Oval Office, have you noticed that? It's still blank. I think he's making it look like the boardroom in The Apprentice. I really do. Was there stuff on it? In the Oval Office? Are you sure? So that's happened in the last 24 hours? Just as I formulated my theory? I think a more empathetic visitor here would not have pointed that out. Y'all have stuff to do, don't you?
Probably should finish, but what a delight to have you, John.
No, my pleasure. And I got a cigar.
It's a treat for you to be here. We are really thankful.
Oh, my pleasure.
I spent an evening with Jon Meacham one time, and he's Jon Meacham.
He's taller and richer.
We have a small
Brad's annual fund would be in better shape if I were John Grisham.